Howdy folks, it's Juno here. Zombies. It's a weird place to start, but you know that on this channel I do talk about some current events, some modern themes, the difference between our society now and maybe the progenitors to our society and where we link and where we don't. And I think zombies casts a really interesting glare over a lot of that discussion. Now I suspect on some level that the obsession with zombies that we see in film, television and video entertainment, video games specifically, I think a lot of it has to do with, well, I'll compare it to something else. Do you know how in like superhero movies, like the first superhero movie almost always is the hero and his special abilities versus another hero with similar special abilities? Okay, so very rarely is it like, you know, Iron Man goes and fights something like they had this one where it was a terrorist, right? Iron Man goes and fights a terrorist. But actually in the end, the boss battle is with kind of these enhanced beings instead. But if you look to the first Iron Man film, it's basically Iron Man versus like bigger Iron Man. That's the boss battle at the end of the film. That's the climax of the movie. And you can even argue to some extent the second one was Iron Man versus Iron Men, except now Iron Man has a friend. So yeah, it's like quite often you see this reflective narrative where it's something against itself in a way. And I think zombies are the same thing. I think zombies in some way are, and again, I know I'm being very pretentious and over-analytical here, but I would argue that there is some semblance of reason to say that when we describe zombies, what we're really describing is our mortality. And we visualize that with the decrepit and deteriorating, decomposing nature of the zombies. And then we give it animation by showing its slow creeping march towards us as unstoppably this doom that is headed towards us and that we can't really resist because it's overwhelming, right? But one zombie might not be a problem. One death in the world isn't really a problem, but it seems like everything dies. It seems like there are zombies everywhere. And while at first they seem like they're walking and they're slow, once you accumulate that, it suddenly feels like a rush, like a wave upon you. And again, I think this is on some level a reflection of man's challenge against his own mortality, in his attempt to stave it off, to fight it off, his desire to fight against it. But ultimately the futility of it, the futility of trying to imagine oneself immortal and deny the mortality of yourself. And that's I think the fascination with zombies, how they keep getting reiterated over and over again into all these different themes. I mean, I like this game Dark Souls, for example, but at the core of the game, it's a game about zombies, right? It's been done very elegantly, and it's been fleshed out into a different direction, but the core of it is a zombie game. I mean, some of the most popular games of recent years have been games that involve zombies. Some of the most popular films have had zombies as a major feature of them. And these unnatural beings, in some way, is a way of representing to us the metaphysical or the psychological battle against mortality that people undertake, and it's a way to exemplify it, to physically represent it, and for us to be able to then analyze it as we would analyze other things physically. Because it is very important. Media, the arts allow us to reconstitute certain concepts or certain phenomenon into a physical form so that then they can be analyzed, because we are most adept at analyzing things physically. Analyzing them abstractly is very difficult, but by giving them a semblance of physical form, it allows us to analyze much more easily, use our higher functions, and our natural instincts become much more highly leveraged if we can somehow encapsulate it in a physical form. And art is a wonderful way of allowing you to do that. I mean, some people can do it conceptually, can just do it through their own, the power of their mind, and they can formulate thoughts in that way naturally, and then are able to tackle them. But I was thinking about this the other day, like, you want to analyze things in isolation. Things don't exist in isolation in reality. Everything is contiguous. But in the way that you want to begin to understand it and solve it or manage it in some way, you always begin by observing it in isolation or trying to isolate it. And so if a difficult event is coming up, you could say, well, you can't predict it, so why don't you just go through it and react as you naturally would, and then that's the most honest, genuine version of events. But I personally find that while it's highly mentally draining, I do find it beneficial to analyze what I potentially think might happen in the future before it happens, and then begin to determine some kind of a roadmap for dealing with it under those assumptions that I've made. And the reason I do that is because in the moment, there may be an emotional component to it. Right? As you're living through things, it is difficult to detract an emotional component from it. But one way of handling that effectively is with experience. With experience, you're able to make better predictions, and you're not so influenced by emotions in the moment because all the experiences end up kind of overlapping one into another. So it's really unsure as to whether it's really happening now or it's happened in the past. Therefore, you are able to reduce the amount of immediate emotion you feel because it's somewhat overwritten by your prior experience. A fresh experience, by nature, is going to be more emotive. Therefore, if you want to prepare yourself for a situation to reduce the amount of emotive content in it and allow you to function in the hopefully most practicable way, then map it out, simulate it, think about it beforehand. It is exhausting to do that, and you could consider it ruminating in a way. However, I think there is genuine benefits to it. There are genuine benefits to playing it out in your head and thinking of the correct potential actions, thinking of the correct potential solutions without the pressure of the moment actually impacting your decisions. Because you fundamentally will make different decisions if there is a significant amount of pressure applied. I think it's difficult to avoid that. But if you're already determined before something happens what your decision is going to be, then when it happens, you will feel less emotional about the situation, or at least your emotions will interact less with your decisions. And I think that's an important way to manage a situation. And so when I look at art, I think art is doing the same thing in a lot of ways, right? Some art is very reflective on the past, asks us to reconceptualize what happened in the past and reframe it into different ways so that we can think about it differently. But equally, art gives us the ability to perhaps look into the future as, how do we deal with things as we age and as we develop, things that have not yet happened. How do we address them in a mature and productive way? Art definitely can fulfill that function in some ways. And I think when I look at the zombie trope, the horror tropes in modern media, I think a lot of it is attention seeking. So it's trying to shock you, to grab your attention because there's such huge competition for attention. But also I think it is trying to have a conversation, even if without showing it the due respect, but still trying to address it in some way. I think it is trying to have a conversation about, mortality and mortality salience and risk avoidance and the inevitability of death, and how our society tries to embrace and deal with that. Because a lot of society doesn't. A lot of society tries to scoop death under the rug, and I think things like respawn, right? The concept of respawn is not necessarily new. It's been around for a while, but you look to the older versions. Let's say you played in an arcade in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now, if you were playing in an arcade in the 80s, you would have like a certain number of lives, but then the game was over. So there was finality to something. It might not have been immediate, but it was there. Now the arcade is at home, and you've already paid X amount for the game, so they're just going to let you replay as much as you want. So there's no need to give you just 3 lives anymore. There's no need to get an extra life or whatever. Now you just have infinite respawn. And I think in a way that's also impacted our ability that's impaired our ability perhaps to recognize mortality in a realistic way, in a fashion that is communicable to ourselves as individuals. So, I've made the claim before, and I stand by it, that society at large tries to push mortality to the side and just keep you on the mill. Just keep you thinking, well, it's this forever and this is fine. when actually you frame it differently and you put different restrictions on the same action, suddenly you realize, hold on, this isn't forever, and therefore this right now isn't fine. This should change because you only have a limited amount of time to be around. So do you want to spend X amount, paying off your mortgage, which is going to get to a point at some point. I mean, maybe mortgage prices are intricately linked to mortality salience. Maybe mortgage prices are able to climb so high and to exist as a constant in some people's lives until their retirement or even further, because people aren't conscious of their retirement, they're not conscious of their death when they sign up to the mortgage agreement. Therefore, they just think they can pay it in perpetuity. And believe me, the bank obviously wants that, right? It's a good business move to have people agreeing to just infinite payments. No matter how small, if you stretch it over a long enough period, it makes good business sense. So I could understand why they would take advantage of that situation. Would they promote it? Perhaps. But this is the thing as well, like, promoting a disadvantageous situation for somebody else so that you can benefit it's not as rare as you think it might be. I think promoting a disadvantageous situation for somebody else has been around for a very long time, and I think we all find little ways of doing it in our lives that we excuse ourselves for, we explain it away, or we say that it's only fair because it's being done to us at the same time. Now, I might have talked in another video about this, but I'd love to touch on it again, and that's this idea that, when I was reading Don Quixote, one thing I noticed was towards the end of the book, there were people who profited from his delusions. From his madness, they were able to extract something for themselves, and therefore that incentivized them to feed into it and continue it. And while that sounds disturbing in principle, the truth is, in the book, the characters would have seen really nothing wrong with it, and one of them even makes a case for why it's a positive thing when asked. And it's undeniable to some degree that, somebody else's mental illness could definitely serve to your benefit. You could easily make the argument, to your actual financial, physical benefit, if you maintain or someone else's mental illness persists. And there's very negative interpretations of this. For example, like, there are stories of gangs that go around leeching off individuals, like, benefits payments for people who have mental illnesses. Like, so they're physically unable to work because of their whatever psychological condition they have, and they get these benefits payments, and then groups of unscrupulous characters locate these people, and then they basically farm them. They keep them in very bad conditions, and they just make sure to claim, at every interval on every handout that's available, and then they basically rob them. And because they're so vulnerable, they're easy to rob. And this is the thing. This is the thing about mental illness, is that it's a kind of vulnerability in a way. And the reason that people are able to profit is because of that level of vulnerability. In fact, if anything, our society now is so obsessed with vulnerability that we really have no way of properly talking about it anymore. Okay, so on the one hand, I don't want to rail against big business and corporations because it's too easy. Like, it's almost become a smokescreen. It's so easy to rail against them. Like, it stops us from actually talking about things that are important. But nevertheless, it has to be addressed that you are kept somewhat vulnerable in terms of your financial security, and that's intentional. It's intentional so that you don't think long term, you think short term, and someone else gets to reap the benefits of the long term because they're not competing with you for them. Equally, society is obsessed with concealing vulnerability when it's to do with individuals. Like, you hear cancel culture. People are so scared now that they have to separate themselves from anything that's perceived as vulnerable. You'll see people defending, like, Twitter statuses, Twitter posts they made 10 years ago. They'll start defending them and doubling down and saying that no, they were always right, because they feel too vulnerable to admit they were wrong. And I don't blame them for that. There is true vulnerability now. The knives are out for a lot of people. And to distract from themselves, or to, make a greater context for their own failings, they're chasing the failings of other people, whatever it is, there are the knives out, and people are hyper aware of vulnerabilities, and so they're distorting reality to offset them. And that is a protective and defensive move, but societally it's a destructive move. And I often wonder about the downfall of civilization, and I do think to myself, is it just this? Is it just that, it gets to a point where everybody's so security conscious that they lose any ability to cooperate anymore, and so they just end up going in completely different directions. And it can be argued that when civilizations have collapsed before, that's been followed by some awful things, and then people look back and go, no, the awful things caused the collapse. And it's really difficult to say. It's really difficult to analyze. Was it that societies collapsed, and then when the cooperation no longer worked anymore, then people started dying, or was it people started dying and that caused civilizational collapse? It's always difficult to make that analysis, but I think it's worth exploring both sides before you make a decision. And so, as I'm saying, if people are so concerned these days about protecting themselves that they're willing to just continually double down on things that are incorrect and, in effect, do some sort of inadvertent gaslighting of other people, because we always want to be agreed with, right? This is the thing. I talked about this before. Like, everybody wants there to be like a confirmation bias towards them. So the minute you can get someone to agree with you, you'll always have a few doubts, even if you're pretty sure you're right. We work on a bit of a hive mind. It's not highly linked, but it is there, and so we are looking for other people to affirm or confirm our beliefs, and so we will feel more right if more people join in, and these become like regional. It becomes geographical. This section believes this, and then this section over here believes something else, and then within that delta, they can't both be right. One has to be exclusionary, and no one wants to cede the ground. No one wants to cede that dominance. So then inevitably you have a conflict. And that's exactly what happens on social media now. You get two sets of people, or more, who are so security conscious about themselves that they can't ever extract themselves from what they said, I don't know, like a year ago. We could look at someone made a comment about this to do with the lab leak hypothesis, and they said, people were so against the lab leak hypothesis because of who it was associated with it, that now they find it still, even though those people are out of the picture, still impossible to consider it no matter how much evidence is presented, because they never want to be seen associated with that or disagreeing with themselves. So it is seen that if you contradict yourself, that's now a personal vulnerability. You have admitted that you can be wrong, therefore you can no longer be trusted. And that kind of, and when you're put at a disadvantage like that, I can understand why someone would go, no, I just won't admit I was wrong ever. I'll just stick to my guns. No matter what the truth is, the truth doesn't matter. I'll just stick to my guns, and as long as I'm not shown to be wrong, I'm not vulnerable. So it's all the security conscious motivation for how they portray the world, no matter what they really believe. That's not important. You can't know what someone really believes unless they tell you, right? The truth is what you tell people it is. I think that was, what was that? Catch Me If You Can or something like that. I don't know. But there's something to it. We do it by communicating with each other, but at some point we're going to come to the realization that we can't trust anything anyone else says, and most of the time we can't even trust what we say, because what we say is for the benefit of others, and so we're looking for some congruence between what they say and what we say, and they have to mesh together so that we can find some secure ground to cooperate on. And I don't know. It's interesting. I can understand how in an environment like that you get the Dark Ages, where actual knowledge is really lost for the long term, because how are you supposed to pass it on if you're under such stringent regulation of what you can and can't say? How are you supposed to pass on important knowledge? I think I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much for listening, guys. I think I'll catch you next time.